My name is Margaret Ellen Crawford, though I was born Margaret Ellen Sutton, and for 19 years I bore the name Margaret Ellen Thompson, which I despised every day I carried it. I was born on the 11th of June in the year 1842 in Hamilton County, Ohio, not far from the city of Cincinnati. I'm now in my 85th year, and I have lived long enough to see the world transform in ways I could never have imagined as a child. But there is one thing that has not changed in all these years, one truth that remains as solid and immovable as stone. I never forgave my mother for what she did to me. She has been dead these 17 years, and still I cannot forgive her. I suppose I must explain what she did and why it marked me so profoundly that even now, at the end of my long life, I cannot bring myself to speak her name without bitterness. But to understand the magnitude of her betrayal, you must first understand something of the world I was born into and the circumstances that led to her decision. I was the eldest of 6 children born to Thomas and Catherine Sutton. My father was a farmer, the son of farmers, who had come to Ohio from Pennsylvania in 1838, seeking land that could be purchased at a reasonable price. He acquired 120 acres in Hamilton County, good farmland with a creek running through it, and there he established himself. My mother was the daughter of a merchant in Cincinnati, and she had married somewhat beneath her station when she wed my father. This fact she never allowed anyone to forget, least of all my father. I was born in 1842, followed by my sister Sarah in 1844, my brother Thomas in 1846, my sister Elizabeth in 1848, my brother James in 1850, and finally my sister Mary in 1852. All 6 of us survived to adulthood, which was unusual for that era, though I sometimes wondered if survival was truly a blessing, given what some of us endured. My childhood was, for the most part, unremarkable. We lived as farm families lived, working from dawn until dark, producing most of what we consumed, selling whatever surplus we could manage at the market in Cincinnati. The journey to market was itself an undertaking, 8 miles each way, requiring the better part of a day. My father would load the wagon with whatever we had to sell, eggs, butter, vegetables in season, sometimes a pig or chickens, and we would depart before dawn to arrive when the market opened. Cincinnati in those days was a growing city, expanding rapidly with the influx of German and Irish immigrants. The market was a cacophony of noise and activity, vendors hawking their wares, livestock bellowing, people bargaining in a dozen different languages. I found it both exciting and overwhelming. My mother, however, viewed it with disdain. She had been raised in Cincinnati, the daughter of a merchant who dealt in dry goods, and she considered the market beneath her dignity. She never accompanied us on these trips, preferring to remain at home where she did not have to witness what she considered our rural backwardness. My father was a kind man, patient and gentle, though he lacked the ambition my mother felt he should possess. She came from a family that valued commerce and advancement, and she could not comprehend why my father was content with his modest farm, when he might, in her view, have aspired to something greater. She spoke often of her father's shop, of the fine families who had been their customers, of the life she had known before she married my father. She had married beneath her station, and she never forgot it, nor allowed anyone else to forget it. The tension between my parents was a constant presence in our household. My mother criticized everything my father did, his farming methods, his modest ambitions, his contentment with what he had achieved. She wanted more, a larger house, finer clothing, social standing in Cincinnati society. My father, for his part, simply wanted to provide for his family and work his land in peace. The conflict was never openly acknowledged, but it permeated everything. As the eldest child, I was particularly aware of this tension. My mother confided in me her disappointments, her regrets about the life she had chosen. She told me repeatedly that I must not make the same mistake she had made. I must marry well, marry up, marry someone with prospects and ambition. A woman's only opportunity for advancement, she informed me, was through marriage. Everything else was illusion. Looking back now, I understand that my mother was deeply unhappy in her marriage, though she would never have admitted it. She had married for love, or what she believed was love, and had discovered that love without financial security and social position was insufficient. This realization had embittered her, and she was determined that her daughters would not repeat her error. My education was limited to what the local school could provide, which was a one-room schoolhouse that operated perhaps 4 months in the year. The teacher was a young woman named Miss Emily Winters, who had herself received but a modest education at a female academy in Cincinnati. She instructed us in reading, writing, arithmetic, and a smattering of geography and history. I was a capable student, and I harbored hopes of continuing my education, perhaps even becoming a teacher myself. My mother dismissed such notions as foolish. A woman's destiny, she informed me, was to marry well and manage a household. Education beyond basic literacy was unnecessary and potentially detrimental, for it might give a girl ideas above her station. When I persisted in my interest, she became angry. Did I think I was better than she was? Did I imagine I was too good for domestic duties? I was getting above myself, and she would not tolerate it. I learned to keep my aspirations to myself. I continued to read every book I could obtain. Miss Winters lent me volumes from her own collection, and I devoured them in whatever spare moments I could find. I read poetry, novels, histories, anything that would transport me beyond the confines of our farm. My mother disapproved, but as long as I completed my chores, she did not actively forbid it. My connection with my father was different. He was not demonstrative, but he was gentle and encouraging. When he discovered me reading one evening by candlelight, he did not scold me for wasting candles. Instead, he asked what I was reading, and when I showed him the book, it was a volume of essays by Washington Irving. He nodded approvingly and said that learning was never wasted, even for a girl. My mother, overhearing this, gave him a withering look, but said nothing. I think my father understood that my mother was unhappy, and I think he felt guilty about it, though he had done nothing wrong beyond being who he was. He tried to please her, tried to give her what she wanted within his modest means, but it was never enough. She wanted a life he could not provide, and his inability to give it to her was a constant source of disappointment. When I was 14 years old in the autumn of 1856, my father died. He had been working in the fields, bringing in the harvest, when he collapsed. My brother Thomas found him lying in the corn rows, already dead. The physician who examined him said it had been his heart, He was 42 years old. My father's death destroyed our family, though not immediately. At first we simply grieved. My mother wept for weeks, and we children did our best to comfort her while managing the farm as well as we could. But as the weeks turned to months, it became clear that we were in serious financial difficulty. My father had purchased the farm with borrowed money, and there remained a substantial debt to be repaid. Moreover, the farm required labor that we could not adequately provide. My brother Thomas was only 10 years old, far too young to manage the heavy work. We hired men when we could afford it, but the wages quickly depleted what little savings we possessed. By the spring of 1857, my mother was in a state of desperation. The mortgage holder was threatening to foreclose on the farm. We had no money, no prospects, and no male relative who could or would assist us. My mother's family in Cincinnati had disowned her when she married my father, and they showed no inclination to relent now that she was widowed. It was in May of 1857 that my mother informed me I was to be married. I was 14 years old, not yet 15. The man she had selected was Jeremiah Thompson, a widower of 45, who owned a large farm some 20 miles distant. He had 5 children from his previous marriage, the youngest of whom was older than I was. He needed a wife to manage his household and bear him more children, and he was willing to pay handsomely for the privilege. In exchange for my hand in marriage, Mr. Thompson would pay off the mortgage on our farm, allowing my mother and siblings to remain there. I was not consulted about this arrangement. I was informed of it. When I protested, and I did protest most vehemently, my mother told me I was being selfish and ungrateful. Did I not understand that we would lose everything if I refused? Did I not care about my brothers and sisters who would be turned out into the road? I had a duty to my family, she said, and I would fulfill it. I begged her to find another way. I pleaded with her to give me time, to allow me to grow older, to at least meet this man before agreeing to marry him. She refused all of it. The arrangement was made, the papers were signed, and I would marry Jeremiah Thompson whether I wished it or not. I met my future husband for the first time on the day of our wedding. He arrived at our farm in a wagon, accompanied by a minister, and my mother hustled me into my Sunday dress and informed me the ceremony would take place immediately. I remember looking at Jeremiah Thompson and feeling nothing but revulsion. He was old, older than my father had been when he died. His face was weathered and hard, his hands enormous and rough. He looked at me the way one might look at livestock being purchased at market, assessing my value, determining whether I would prove worth the price he was paying. The ceremony was brief. I spoke my vows in a whisper, barely able to force the words past the constriction in my throat. My mother stood beside me, her hand gripping my arm so tightly it left bruises. When it was done, Jeremiah Thompson took my small bundle of belongings, lifted me into his wagon, and drove me away from the only home I had ever known. I looked back once and saw my mother standing in the doorway watching us depart. She did not wave. She did not weep. She simply stood there, and then she turned and went inside. I have never, in all the years since, been able to purge from my memory the despair I felt during that wagon ride. I was 14 years old, a child, being carried away to live with a stranger more than 3 times my age. I had no choice in the matter, no voice, no power. I'd been sold as surely as if I had been chattel at auction, and the fact that the transaction was legal and sanctioned by both church and state did not make it any less a betrayal. My life with Jeremiah Thompson was exactly as miserable as I had feared it would be. He was not overtly cruel in the manner of men who beat their wives or inflicted deliberate physical harm, but he was cold, controlling, and utterly devoid of kindness. He viewed me as property he had purchased, an investment that was expected to provide returns. Those returns came in the form of labor and children. His farmhouse was large but cheerless. It had been built by his first wife, who had died in childbirth some 2 years before I arrived. Her presence lingered everywhere, in the furniture she had selected, in the curtains she had sewn, in the garden she had planted. Jeremiah spoke of her often, always in comparison to me. She had been a good wife, he would say. She had known her place. She had not been willful or difficult.
Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never be on YouTube. These are the voices too personal, too raw to share publicly, completely unedited, nothing cut. If you want access, the link is in the description. It's called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us keep making these videos. All right, back to the story.
I was expected to manage his household, which was substantial. His 5 children from his first marriage ranged in age from 15 to 22, and none of them were pleased to have a stepmother younger than themselves. The eldest, a daughter named Abigail, was particularly hostile. She had managed the household since her mother's death, and she resented being displaced by a child bride whom she viewed with contempt. The 4 younger children followed her lead, treating me as an interloper and a servant rather than as their father's wife. Jeremiah did nothing to intervene in this treatment. When I attempted to assert any authority, he told me I was being presumptuous. His children had been raised properly by their mother, and they did not require instruction from me. My role was to cook, clean, and bear his children. Everything else was beyond my purview. I cooked 3 substantial meals every day for a household that could number as many as 10 people when Jeremiah's hired men were present for harvest or other heavy labor. I baked bread twice weekly. I churned butter. I tended the garden, which was extensive and required constant attention. I preserved food for winter, canning vegetables and fruits, smoking meat, making sausages. I made soap from lye and animal fat, a process that left my hands raw and blistered. I made candles. I sewed and mended clothing for the entire household. I cleaned the house, though it was large and the labor never ending. I worked from before dawn, rising at 4 o'clock to start the fires and begin breakfast, until well after dark, when I would finally collapse into bed, exhausted beyond description. There was no respite, no day of rest, no acknowledgement of the work I performed. It was simply expected, and any failure to meet those expectations resulted in Jeremiah's cold displeasure, which manifested in silent treatment and withheld affection. Not that there was much affection to withhold. The loneliness of that first year was profound. I had been torn from my family, from everyone I knew, and placed in a household where I was viewed as an unwelcome addition. I had no friends, no confidants, no one to whom I could express my misery. Jeremiah's children spoke to me only when necessary, and usually with barely concealed contempt. Jeremiah himself spoke to me primarily to issue instructions or criticism. Within 6 months of our marriage, I was with child. I was 15 years old, still a child myself, and I was terrified. I knew nothing of childbirth beyond what I had observed in animals, and no one troubled to enlighten me. Jeremiah's daughters knew certainly, but they offered no guidance or comfort. When I finally worked up the courage to ask Abigail what I might expect, she gave me a cold smile and said, "You will discover soon enough what it means to be a wife." When my time came, in March of 1858, I endured labor alone, save for a midwife whom Jeremiah had summoned. She was an elderly woman, rough and unsympathetic, who seemed to view childbirth as something women must simply endure without complaint. The labor lasted 20 hours, and the pain was beyond anything I had imagined possible. I was certain I would die, and at times I almost hoped I would, for death seemed preferable to such agony. But I didn't die. The child, a boy, was born just after dawn, and when the midwife placed him in my arms, I felt something shift inside me. Here was someone who depended upon me, someone who needed me, someone I could love without reservation or fear. I named him John, after my father's father, and I loved him fiercely from that first moment. Jeremiah was pleased to have another son. He viewed children as assets, additional laborers who would contribute to the farm's productivity as they grew. He was particularly pleased that I had proven capable of bearing healthy children, for he wanted many more. That, after all, had been part of the bargain. My mother had sold him a young wife who could give him a second family. Over the next 11 years, I bore 6 more children. The pregnancies came in rapid succession. William in 1859, Mary in 1861, Catherine in 1863, Thomas in 1865, Elizabeth in 1867, and finally Sarah in 1869. 7 children in 11 years, each pregnancy taking its toll on my body and my spirit. By the time Sarah was born, I was 27 years old, and I felt ancient. My body was worn, my youth squandered on bearing and raising children while managing a large household with no assistance. Of these 7 children, 6 survived to adulthood. We lost Catherine to scarlet fever when she was 2 years old in 1865. The disease swept through our county that winter, killing many children. Catherine sickened suddenly, her throat swelling, her fever raging. Within 3 days, she was dead. I held her as she died, watching her struggle for breath, powerless to help her. The grief was overwhelming, compounded by exhaustion and the realization that I was pregnant again. Thomas would be born 4 months later. Jeremiah's response to Catherine's death was to inform me that we would have more children to replace the one we had lost. He viewed it as a simple matter of arithmetic, 1 child subtracted, another to be added. He had no comprehension of grief, or if he did, he had no patience for it. Work continued. Life continued. There was no time for mourning. The years of my marriage coincided with the Civil War, which brought its own hardships. Jeremiah was too old to be conscripted, and his sons from his first marriage had left home by the time the war began. The eldest had married and moved to Indiana. The others had gone to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Ohio, being a Union state, was not subject to the devastation visited upon the South, but the war affected us nonetheless. Prices rose dramatically as the war consumed resources. Coffee became prohibitively expensive, and we substituted roasted grains. Sugar was scarce. Fabric was difficult to obtain, and I made do with what I could. The government issued war bonds and imposed taxes to fund the war effort, and Jeremiah complained bitterly about the financial burden, though he was prosperous enough to bear it without true hardship. Young men from our county marched away to fight in places whose names I had never heard: Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg. The lists of casualties were posted in the town square, and each time I saw them, I thought of the mothers and wives who were receiving the news that their sons and husbands would not return. I remember the lists growing longer and longer, the names multiplying with each campaign, each battle. During those war years, I sometimes allowed myself to wonder what my life might have been if my mother had not forced me to marry Jeremiah Thompson. I would be 23 when the war ended, still young, still capable of building a different life. Perhaps I might have married a young man, someone who would have gone to war and returned, or perhaps not returned, leaving me a widow, but at least a widow with dignity and the sympathy of the community, rather than a child bride trapped in a loveless marriage. But such thoughts were dangerous and futile. They accomplished nothing beyond making my present circumstances more unbearable, so I pushed them aside and focused on what I could control, which was precious little. I focused on my children, on giving them what affection and care I could provide in a household that was otherwise cold and loveless. I focused on survival, on enduring each day, on maintaining my sense of self, even as everything conspired to erase it. Jeremiah died in January of 1876, when I was 33 years old. He was 64, and he had been in declining health for several years. His heart had been weak. The physician attributed it to a lifetime of hard labor and a constitution that had never been particularly robust. In his final months, he became increasingly frail, unable to work, confined to his bed. I tended to him as I had tended to everything else in his household, dutifully, competently, without affection. When he finally passed on a cold January morning, I felt nothing but relief. I stood beside his deathbed and felt only a profound sense of liberation. After 19 years of servitude, I was finally free. The funeral was well attended, for Jeremiah had been a respected member of the community. People spoke of his industry, his success as a farmer, his standing in the church. No one spoke of the 14-year-old girl he had purchased as a wife, or the 19 years she had spent as little more than an unpaid servant. Such things were not discussed. They were simply accepted as the natural order. His estate passed to me and my children, as was customary. His older children from his first marriage had long since established themselves elsewhere and had no claim. I found myself, at 33, a widow, with 6 surviving children ranging in age from 7 to 18, and the owner of a substantial farm that was entirely debt-free. Jeremiah, whatever his other failings, had been an excellent manager of finances. The farm was prosperous, and I inherited not only the land, but also considerable savings. For the first time in my adult life, I had autonomy, I had power, I had choices. And I discovered that I was more than capable of managing the farm without a husband. Indeed, I found that I was better at it than Jeremiah had been, for I was willing to consider new methods and improvements rather than clinging to old ways simply because they were familiar. I hired laborers when needed, paying fair wages and treating them with respect. I made decisions about what to plant and when to sell, consulting agricultural journals and learning everything I could about improved farming techniques. I managed the finances meticulously. invest in surplus income wisely. My children worked alongside me, and together we prospered. Within 5 years, I had increased the farm's productivity by nearly 40%, a fact that surprised many in the community who had assumed that a woman could not possibly manage such affairs. I also made changes to the household itself. I hired a young woman to assist with the heavy housework, freeing me to focus on farm management. I purchased labor-saving devices as they became available, a mechanical butter churn, an improved washing machine, a sewing machine manufactured by the Singer Company. I was no longer interested in martyring myself to endless drudgery. I'd spent 19 years working myself to exhaustion. I would not spend the rest of my life doing the same. I never remarried. Numerous men made overtures over the years. I was young, I was prosperous, and I was available. Widowers seeking wives, bachelors seeking households, even younger men seeking financial security through marriage to a propertied woman. But I had no desire whatsoever to place myself once again under the authority of a man. I had learned what it meant to be property, and I would never again surrender my freedom. The law might insist that women were better off married, that they required male protection and guidance, but I knew better. I had experienced marriage, and I wanted no part of it ever again. This decision scandalized some in the community. A widow was expected to remarry, particularly a young widow with children. My refusal to do so was viewed as unnatural, even suspicious. There were whispers that I was too proud, that I considered myself above my proper station, that I would come to regret my independence when I was old and had no one to care for me. But I did not care. For the first time in my life, I was free to make my own choices, and I chose independence over any man's authority. My children thrived under my management. My eldest son, John, attended college. I paid for his education without hesitation, for I understood the value of learning in a way my mother never had. He became a physician and established a successful practice in Cincinnati. William took over a portion of the farm and proved himself a capable farmer, eventually purchasing additional land and prospering in his own right. My daughters received educations far beyond what I had been allowed. I ensured that they attended the Female Academy in Cincinnati, learning not only domestic arts, but also mathematics, literature, science, and history. They grew into capable, independent women who would have choices I had never been afforded. In 1879, when I was 37 years old and my circumstances had stabilized considerably, I decided to visit my mother and siblings in Hamilton County. It had been 22 years since I had been forced to leave, 22 years since I had watched my childhood home disappear behind me as Jeremiah Thompson's wagon carried me away to a life I had not chosen. I had maintained minimal correspondence over those years, dutiful but distant letters announcing births and deaths, acknowledging holidays, maintaining the barest thread of familial connection. But I had not returned in person, and I was uncertain whether I could bear to do so. I went partly out of curiosity, partly out of a sense of duty, and partly because I wanted my mother to see what I had become, despite what she had done to me. I had survived. I had prospered. I had built a life worth living. I wanted her to see that she had not destroyed me, though she had certainly tried. The journey from my farm to my mother's took the better part of a day by wagon. As I traveled those familiar roads, I found myself assailed by memories I'd been 14 when I last made this journey, a terrified child being carried away to marry a stranger. Now I was 37, a widow, a successful farm manager, a mother myself. The girl I had been seemed like someone else entirely, someone I had known long ago but could barely remember. The farm I had left was much changed. My brother Thomas, now 33 years old, had married and taken over its management. He and his wife Elizabeth had made substantial improvements. A new barn, expanded fields, better fencing, a prosperous appearance that my father would have been proud to see. My younger sisters had married and moved away, Sarah to Indiana, Elizabeth to Illinois, Mary to Kentucky. Only my sister Sarah, the second eldest, remained at home, unmarried at 35, and helping to care for our aging mother. My mother was 62 years old when I saw her again. Her hair had gone gray, her face was lined with age, and she moved with the stiffness of advancing years. But her eyes were the same, sharp, assessing, critical. When she saw me arriving in my wagon, dressed in the respectable clothing of a prosperous widow, she came out to the road to meet me. She wept when she embraced me, and for a brief moment I felt something stir inside me, some remnant of the love I had once borne her, some vestige of the bond between mother and daughter. But then she began to speak, and that momentary softening vanished. "Margaret," she said, holding me at arm's length to examine me, "you look well, prosperous. I'm glad to see that Mr. Thompson provided adequately for you." I said nothing to this, though I might have pointed out that my prosperity had nothing to do with Jeremiah's provision and everything to do with my own management since his death. "Come inside," she continued. "Sarah will prepare tea. You must tell me everything, your children, your circumstances, your life. It has been so long." We went inside, and I was struck by how small the house seemed. It had loomed large in my childhood memories, but now it appeared modest, even cramped. We sat in the parlor, a room I remembered as the finest in the house, though now it seemed plain and outdated. My mother spoke at length about the difficulties she had endured over the years. My father's death had been such a blow, she said. The farm had been mortgaged, and she had been desperate, utterly desperate. She had been forced to make terrible choices, choices no mother should have to make. But she had done what was necessary to preserve the family, to keep the farm, to ensure that my younger siblings had a home. "I hope you understand, Margaret," she said, looking at me earnestly. "I hope you know that I did what I had to do. A mother must sometimes make sacrifices for her children." I realized, listening to her, that she had convinced herself that she was the one who had sacrificed. In her narrative, she was the hero, the suffering mother who had made difficult choices for the greater good. The fact that her choice had involved selling her 14-year-old daughter to a man 3 times her age had been rewritten in her mind as an act of maternal devotion. I could have challenged this delusion. I could have told her exactly what my life had been like during those 19 years of marriage to Jeremiah Thompson. I could have described the loneliness, the grind and labor, the 7 pregnancies before I was even 25 years old, the absolute absence of choice or autonomy, the daily humiliations large and small. I could have made her understand what she had done, but I knew it would accomplish nothing. She would not hear it. She could not hear it. for to do so would require her to acknowledge that she had committed a profound wrong, and she was incapable of such acknowledgement. She had built a narrative in which she was blameless, even noble, and she would defend that narrative against any evidence to the contrary. I survived, I said simply. I raised my children. I'm managing the farm. Of course you are, she replied, seeming pleased. I always knew you were capable, and now you're comfortably established, widowed it is true, but with means. You should consider remarrying, Margaret. A woman alone is vulnerable, and you have your children to think of. I wanted to laugh at this, or perhaps to scream. After what she had done, after forcing me into one disastrous marriage, she was now advising me to enter another. She truly understood nothing. I will not remarry, I said firmly. I am content as I am. She frowned at this. That is pride speaking, Margaret. Pride is unbecoming in a woman. You should not set yourself above your proper place. Her proper place. How often had I heard that phrase in my youth? A woman's proper place, a girl's proper place, the natural order of things. It was the justification for everything, for my lack of education, for my forced marriage, for my mother's betrayal, and she was using it still, even now, trying to convince me that my independence was somehow wrong. I stayed for 3 days, made polite conversation, met my brother's children, helped my sister Sarah with various household tasks. My mother spoke often of her past, of the life she had known before she married my father, of the merchant family she had come from. She seemed to believe that by dwelling on what she had lost, she could justify what she had done. But justification requires truth, and she was incapable of truth. On the 3rd day, as I prepared to depart, my mother embraced me again. Come visit more often, Margaret, she said. We are family, after all. Family must stay connected. I nodded, but said nothing. As I drove away in my wagon, watching the farm recede behind me, I understood with perfect and final clarity that I would never forgive my mother. Not because I was cruel or petty, but because forgiveness requires some recognition of wrongdoing, some expression of regret, some attempt at amends. And my mother offered none of these things. She would go to her grave convinced that she had done right by me, and I would go to mine knowing that she had not. The years that followed were, in many respects, the best of my life. I raised my children, managed my farm, and built a life of independence that I had never imagined possible when I was 14 years old and powerless. My children grew to adulthood and established their own families. I became a grandmother, and then a great-grandmother. The world changed around me. The telephone arrived, then the automobile, then electric lights. I witnessed transformations that would have seemed like sorcery to my younger self. My mother died in 1910 when she was 93 years old. My sister Sarah wrote to inform me and asked if I would attend the funeral. I did not. I sent a polite letter expressing my condolences, but I could not bring myself to stand beside her grave and pretend to mourn. I had mourned my mother long ago. I had mourned her on the day she forced me into marriage, when the mother I had known and trusted revealed herself to be someone willing to sacrifice her child for financial expediency. People have asked me over the years why I cannot forgive her. They point out that she was desperate, that she had few options, that she did what she believed necessary to preserve the family. They suggest that holding on to resentment for so many decades is unhealthy, that it poisons the soul, that I should let it go. But they do not understand. Forgiveness is not simply a decision to cease feeling anger. Forgiveness is a gift, offered in response to repentance and acknowledgement of harm. My mother never repented. She never acknowledged the harm. She never even understood that what she did was wrong. How does one forgive someone who does not believe they require forgiveness? Moreover, my unforgiveness is not the same as bitterness. I do not dwell on what was done to me. I do not allow it to dominate my thoughts or poison my connections with others. I built a good life despite what my mother did, not because of any help from her. My children are healthy and happy. My grandchildren and great-grandchildren bring me joy. I have known friendship, respect, and the satisfaction of having managed my own affairs competently for more than 50 years. But when I think of my mother, which I do rarely for I prefer not to, I feel no warmth, no fondness, no filial affection. I feel nothing but a cold assessment of facts. She sold me to a man 3 times my age when I was 14 years old. She did it to save her farm and preserve her own comfort. She never apologized. She never even acknowledged it was wrong. Those are the facts, and they remain facts no matter how many years pass. I'm 85 years old now, and I have not much time remaining. When I die, I do not expect to be reunited with my mother in some afterlife. I hope very much that if there is a heaven, it is organized in such a way that I need never encounter her again. I have forgiven many people in my long life. I have forgiven my late husband for his coldness, for he knew no other way to be. I have forgiven his children for their resentment, for they were young and foolish. I have forgiven the world for its injustices, for the world cares nothing for individual suffering. But I have not forgiven my mother, and I will not. She had a choice. She chose to save her farm at the cost of her daughter's happiness, and she never once admitted it was wrong. That is unforgivable, not because I am harsh or uncharitable, but because forgiveness without acknowledgement is meaningless. It is play acting, pretending that a wound has healed when it has merely been covered over. I want to be clear about something, lest anyone misunderstand. I do not tell this story to inspire pity or to elicit sympathy. I survived. I endured. I built a life worth living. I have known love. I love my children, and they love me. I have known respect and dignity. I have been my own woman for more than half a century, and that is no small achievement for someone born in 1842. But I tell this story because I believe it is important for people to understand that not all wrongs can be righted, not all wounds can be healed, and not all bonds can be redeemed. Sometimes a parent betrays a child in a way that is so fundamental, so complete, that the connection between them is severed permanently. And that is what my mother did to me. She had other options. She could have sold the farm and moved to Cincinnati to live with relatives who might have relented in their estrangement once she was widowed. She could have sought assistance from the church or from charitable organizations. She could have accepted a smaller, more modest life and allowed me to grow to adulthood before considering marriage. But she chose instead to solve her financial crisis in the quickest and most expedient manner available, which was to sell her 14-year-old daughter to a man who needed a housekeeper and a brood mare. And then she convinced herself that this had been an act of maternal love. That is why I never forgave her. Not because I am incapable of forgiveness, but because she never deserved it. Forgiveness must be earned through acknowledgement and repentance. She offered neither. She went to her grave believing she had done right by me, and I have gone through my life knowing that she did not. I suppose some will judge me harshly for this. They will say I am cold, unloving, unforgiving. They will say a daughter should forgive her mother regardless of the circumstances. To those people I would say, you did not live my life. You did not endure what I endured. You did not spend 19 years as the property of a man you never chose and did not love, bearing his children year after year, powerless and voiceless. I earned my right to unforgiveness. I paid for it with 19 years of my life, with 7 pregnancies, with the loss of my youth and my dreams and my chance at happiness, and I will carry it to my grave without apology. There is a notion, particularly prevalent among those who have not suffered greatly, that forgiveness is always virtuous, that holding on to resentment is always wrong. But I have come to believe that this is false. Sometimes unforgiveness is the only form of justice available to the powerless. My mother wronged me, and she never acknowledged it. My unforgiveness is the only consequence she ever faced for her actions, and even that consequence she never knew about, for I never told her directly that I had not forgiven her. But I knew, and that mattered. I am aware that this may seem like a harsh conclusion to some who hear this testimony, but I am too old to soften my truths or make them more palatable. This is what happened. This is how I feel about it, and I will not pretend otherwise simply to make others more comfortable. My mother has been dead 17 years. I am 85 years old, and I will likely follow her soon enough. When I do, I will go knowing that I lived my life according to my own principles, that I raised my children well, that I managed my own affairs with competence and dignity. I will go knowing that I survived what she did to me, that I built something good despite her betrayal. But I will also go knowing that I never forgave her, and I am at peace with that. That is my story. That is why I never forgave my mother. It is not a tale of reconciliation or redemption. It is simply the truth of what happened and how I have chosen to respond to it. Some may find it sad. Some may find it bitter. I find it simply factual. I was sold at 14. I endured 19 years of servitude. I survived and eventually prospered. My mother never apologized. I never forgave her. Those are the facts, and facts do not change with time or perspective. They simply are.